So obviously we don't have to get through all of these questions, so we'll start it out on you. We don't need to get through all these questions, but these were just more of points that we could launch discussion. So, do you want to say anything off the bat?
I just wanted to start with the first question. I thought we could all say something that went well the last couple weeks teaching, and something that maybe didn't go well or you're frustrated with. Just to start a conversation. I will go first, but I'm not teaching this semester. Makes it challenging. So I'm frustrated with the teaching.
It's a safe question.
Happy to be here.
The last 2 weeks of teaching has just been 1 week of teaching for some of us.
Yeah.
That's true.
that's
I
true.
basically just meant since the last
No,
session.
I know, yeah.
But you're right.
I think that for the most part, there was, especially since, at this point in the semester, I think I've only had my students for 3 times now. It's just kind of getting to know everyone and know, the different classes. Because every class has its own personality. And so, my first 8 a.m. class is much less active and willing to kind of discuss things with each other, maybe because it's 8 a.m., but I think a lot of because of the personalities in the classroom, as my 11 o'clock class is just completely different, which is always interesting to see the different personalities a class can have from.
I agree.
And often it's just a couple different students can make all the difference there. But,
And what are you doing? What class are you?
it's Calc 3 recitation. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that was my question. It's just that would depend if you did a standalone or if you did a recitation or whatnot. It's going to vary.
Yeah.
Oh, Calc 3, you said?
Calc 3. Yeah.
Okay, so you're not doing the TBL stuff.
No.
Okay.
What are you teaching this semester?
Calc 1.
Calc 1.
There's a lot of resistance with the TBL stuff with the projects. They just don't make that connection to some sort of with the expectations of the course when it comes to grade wise, and there's quite a I don't know if it's it's hard to distinguish if it's a TBL thing or if it's a coordinated calculus thing. But it's when I taught, we had neither of the situations, and with the grade, the grading now, it's just I just see it's not the average scores, and the standard deviations are just so far off from say when I taught freshman year or my first year of grad school. So it's kind of a bit shocking about their performance. And I don't know if that's, because of those two systems in place, or if it's one particular system, or if it's neither system, or if it's just because, they're unwilling to be involved or active in their own learning.
Yeah, especially you're talking about the standard deviation being so large, especially if it's something that's bimodal. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, because you might have, those who take initiative in their own learning are doing super well, and those who don't. So you get 2 normal curves combined together. It might be an entirely bimodal kind of.
Or even if they've taken the course last semester and they've already been exposed to this new system, they may be more prepared. But then, I've only had a few students say things to me about how they've taken it in the fall, they failed or they dropped because they didn't do so well on the first exam, and they weren't given proper advising. A proper advisor would say something about it's a new system, you got 40 out of 60, that's actually a pretty decent score. But so I'm not too sure about whether or not it's experience as well, how that factors in.
Do you see this in the weekly quizzes too? Same kind of bimodal, say, or whatever.
Well, I haven't really looked at the statistics in that regards, like a histogram or anything. It could, though.
And did you teach calculus either 1, 2, or 3 last semester?
it was a different Q.
Because I do find that when I've taught Calculus 1 in the spring, it's a different type of student.
Yeah.
So,
I'm teaching Calc 3 for the first time. Yeah, I'm still getting the feel for the types of students, because I feel like, and I think I've seen this in the quizzes more than Calc 1, is it's a little more homogenous. Like there's a little, because they've all been through the experience a little more. Yeah, they're using office hours a lot more too than other students.
So when they come in for office hours, are they mainly asking about the quizzes?
Yeah, it's quiz bank stuff always.
I have honestly had, especially this past week in office hours, I've had quite a few students come in asking more like concept questions than quiz questions. Maybe because there's a test coming up, and probably definitely surely because there's a test coming up. But yeah, I don't know. I found that interesting. I was pleasantly surprised by it.
What about you guys? What's your last couple weeks?
I was annoyed that we had snow days.
Wait, which one?
Teaching assignment doesn't start till the 25th.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
Are you
it's
doing-
the accelerated pre-calc course.
Oh, okay. So no comment.
Then it still ends at the normal time, or does it get like no time?
it starts the 23rd, is that what you said?
The 25th.
25th. So that's like the Monday after their first exam.
Yes.
Interesting.
That's for 143.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Suppose we haven't answered what went well.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, okay.
It's just,
Well,
meant
we
to
had
be
nothing
casual.
to answer with. No.
I will say for what went well, I was a little bit panicked about how this exam, the Calc 2 exam, would go for my students. I just really had very little sense of whether they would do well or not, and they did slightly above average, like 0.7 of a point, and I'm just like, okay, I'll take that.
But also, like, I feel like it was slightly skewed because two of my sections, I don't know how the split was for Christine. Two of them were like really quite good, actually. It seemed like, and one of them was way below average, and now that has been making me think like, wow, I must have really screwed up on the first recitations review or something. But
Well, sometimes it's what do they call them?
Learning
Learning communities.
Yeah.
I had like when I did TBL, I had like an all-star section. They
Yeah.
were all in like a learning community. It was my 8 a.m. and they just did really well
Yep.
compared to my other ones, and they had better chemistry, and they kind of like what you were saying, like certain sections just
Different personalities. and
different
yeah.
personalities.
But your small section did very well.
My small section did well. Again, I'm not convinced it has anything to do with me, though, because
Take the credit.
they're very quiet, and they're very, I think they've got a strong work ethic. In terms of who came to visit my office hours, most of my customers were from my small class, but then again, we're down to 14 students in that class, and so it's kind of a
Has this been changing out, or it just started that small?
well, it started off small. It started off at 18, I want to say, and then a couple have either changed majors or changed sections. So,
Interesting.
Do you mainly have people from last semester that would take
I have
this
about
semester?
half of the students that I had last semester. Yeah.
but some of the new ones are also math majors.
Yes, math or stat. Yeah.
Did anyone do the reading this week? Look at you didn't.
I did.
You
I
did?
did,
Oh,
but
cool.
like 2 weeks ago.
This
so
morning.
I don't
That's
remember.
I did it this morning.
So I guess we should maybe move into talking about the reading. Any initial comments? Otherwise,
Does someone want to summarize?
So I think what was it, at least the third chapter was mostly about the kind of the need to be testing, or just be like helping students to like recall things. Like that's actually how your brain is learning, making connections. Is if you don't just have something in front of you, but you're testing yourself, whatever that looks like.
like mixing up your practice.
Yeah.
And
And just how, it's a constant thing you need to be doing. It's not like you learn everything once, great, you can move on. I think they were talking about surgeons and like how they're constantly need to practicing their basics.
I remember it. The second chapter talking a lot about like how assessment is actually something that can be used as a learning tool more than just as an assessment tool, and how some kind of assessment, low stakes assessment right after learning something did much better than say rereading, rather than saying like rereading a text twice in a row, maybe reading it and then doing some kind of short review back over what the text was talking about was much more effective than the other one. And then third chapter talking about like massed practice versus spacing out practice. Massed practice being like going through things over and over again versus maybe like spiraling and trying out different thing, like moving different. I think they use the term interlacing or interleaving, where you maybe look at a bunch of different topics, and then kind of spiral around and go back through the same thing multiple times, rather than saying, okay, let's figure this out, and then let's move over to the next one, and then let's figure this out. And, the former method, they cited a bunch of things that said that was a much better way for student retention.
Are these results field specific, like math or?
it completely varies.
Yeah.
I mean, they have all these examples, and
Some are even from athletic practices,
yeah.
Oh, okay.
so not necessarily cognitive.
It seems like they try and either pick or cherry pick different examples from
Yeah.
Yeah, depending on what point they're trying
from
to
different
make.
things. Yeah.
I found specifically the testing as a tool for learning when I first read this to be interesting. Because you always, I used to always think about it as just like proving you know it, but really it should be like a tool for learning. Or before I read this, I hadn't thought about that really.
I thought it was interesting the way that they phrased that it's kind of a calibration of where are you at with the learning, so that you can, particularly if you think you're learning and you're just like, oh yeah, I got this, and then you take a test and it's like, oh no, I don't have this. It's a way of assessing, oh, I still have more to learn. So
It's like flashcards. Take a test right away, you know.
There's also the idea too that you retain it better if you test it hard, because that retrieval helps, whereas just showing them the facts again wasn't as good either. So I think how do you get that into your class?
In terms of how does one get it into their class? I thought, if I recall correctly, a couple weeks ago when I was actually reading this, they also talk a bit about how like this Sobel guy, I believe, initially changed to or tried like pop quizzes or something, and that was not the correct way of convincing your students that this was for their benefit. Whereas coming out and saying like, okay, we're going to do all these quizzes because it will help you learn, and that was more convincing to them.
Yeah, I kind of really liked that one case example they had, just kind of showing that like they didn't try something and immediately was like 100% effective.
Yeah.
That, like there is like a lot of kind of trial and error, even within a classroom. He was trying to find the like perfect amount. He's like, well, I can't do them like every day or like once a week, so let's kind of space them back a little bit.
And
fact that they were pop quizzes didn't work either.
Right. When they were
People really
surprised.
hated it,
Okay.
like more than the original arrangement, which was just we're going to have like a couple exams.
Yeah, and this situation wasn't it that they replaced the exams completely with
I
quizzes?
think eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a bunch of low stakes quizzes instead of like a couple huge exams.
Mhm.
I think they said he dropped the final. He didn't do a final there. He didn't want to lose all that class time or something.
Yeah.
Maybe it means their structure is different than ours without the finals week.
Mhm.
Do you think the quizzes in calculus do that? These weekly quizzes?
I think they do provide for a lot of students. I do think that they provide a good sense of whether they're understanding things. I think the quiz bank in general, I think, is abused by some students, and rather than learning what's going on, they'll just memorize the solutions to particular things, right?
Yeah, I agree with Joel. That's kind of been my experience. Working with like a Calc 2, like where there's no quiz bank. We're just like, okay, this is like the topic that the quiz is on, and then seeing the students study the whole topic, and then doing problems that are on that. Versus like, okay, we've just learned how to do these problems.
Yeah, I heard a student say after the class, like every week they knew how to do 10 problems. It's kind of how they felt. They didn't really get.
Like, what was the whole point?
Yeah.
Of, like, this section.
Yeah.
What should I be able to do? Like, what type of thing should I be
Exactly.
looking for?
If they didn't know how to do those problems a week later,
Yeah,
that's
I haven't even
kind of what
I haven't TA'd for the new calc regime, but like it kind of looks like mass practice to me to have this one thing that you study for that covers. That's the only time you see. It kind of looks like. I mean, some of the things will be recurring. Like once you introduce integration by parts, you will use it thereafter, so that gets repeated. But does the
But don't they sometimes put like almost exactly like quiz questions on the exams, and people like don't do well on them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like this, like
Yeah,
I've heard this. Yeah.
Yeah, but then that's like that would be to the point of the book of mass practice is not good, I guess. Possibly.
But then they, I mean, like, but then they fail to apply it. If they can't, like 2 weeks later, can't do the same sort of problems. And I mean, they know how to do integration by parts. They just fail to apply it in like some sort of contextual problem. But it's like, to be frank, I mean, I would say only 5% of my class, 5% of the students that I teach actually perform well on the quizzes. A lot of them, what they do is that they get some sort of obscure answer that they know where to get to, and then they just write a bunch of filler in between that goes absolutely nowhere. And it's just like I keep telling them that I only grade the work.
Mhm.
So it's like I don't care if they put the right answer down. I'm looking at your work, and if I don't see some, clear, consistent flow, it's just
This is calculus or
Calc 1.
okay. Yeah, because I had like 2 or 3 papers per section where they knew the answer.
Yeah.
The work was just god awful.
Or it's just like
Or like they know the big steps, but they can't. You're like, how are you jumping from here to here? And they're like, but you know that they know like this step
This
comes
should be
next.
here.
Yeah, or it's just like, or that might be like a Calc 2 thing where they know these big steps. But like in Calc 1, what they'll do rarely on the quizzes is that they'll change a number or something. And then you see these students reproduce the same thing using the numbers on the quiz bank. And it's like, come on.
Honestly impressive,
Yeah.
right? Like I would not remember those numbers.
Right?
I feel like the quiz bank could be really good if students were motivated to use it the right way too. Like
I was thinking.
I'm always slammed in office hours on Tuesday, the day of the quiz. It'd be
Yeah.
great if they came to saw me on Thursday, thought about it a little, or well, maybe not even see me on Thursday, but they should be sitting and working on their own, and then they just revisit it for like an hour at a time throughout the weekend, and then they get their final everything all polished by Tuesday. I mean,
Well, and they can. I was thinking about that too. They can literally test themselves.
Yeah.
Like they could sit down for 15 minutes, and do the problems in sets of 2, and they'll know how they're going to do in the quiz.
Right.
Right.
So, because I was I was wondering if, so we're talking about these situations where students are kind of abusing this. Is there an effective way for students to use this quiz bank kind of system? And if there is, like, how do we both encourage and ensure students to kind of use them in an effective way? What could be changed to make it?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Several weeks ago, I talked to Steve Butler and just asked him. I said, "Is this a system that you saw somewhere else?" He's like, "No."
Mm-hmm.
He said, "I was writing exams, and students thought they were really hard, and so I would start giving them practice exams in class, and then I realized they needed more practice beyond that. So that's when he started giving exam-like questions and quizzes, which in itself, in terms of wanting them to do well on difficult problems, giving them difficult problems. That I agree. I think that's a process that should work.
Mm-hmm.
But like Lee said, it would work if they would maybe start a little earlier on the process.
Even just focused on understanding it, not memorizing it.
Right.
Repeating.
Do you remember when we had a quiz bank for homework problems and analysis?
Well, yes, I guess. I suppose that was fairly analogous.
How did
Yeah.
that go?
I mean, I'm here, I know, I'm not supposed to, learn, but, I felt like I did all my learning doing the problems.
Mhm.
And then that was just
Yeah.
kind of this, joke of a time. I don't know if it's the same.
Well, it was,
but
especially because he had us turn in the stuff just before we did the quiz, and so it was kind of reproduce your favorite, or his favorite two problems, which.
But I
it
remember
was
going through
worth
before
trying.
class, memorize, what are the big steps, what are the big theorems that I have to remember to put
Yeah.
down on here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's similar. I think I think a quiz would have been better if a definition quiz or a theorem quiz. Here's the hypothesis, put in the conclusion, or here's the conclusion, fill in the hypothesis. Than trying to do a problem.
My abstract algebra teacher in undergrad did quizzes every Friday, and they were all definitions. And his philosophy was you can't write proofs unless you know the definitions. And they would just be 2, a point each, really low stakes. And that wasn't very stressful, but I learned the definitions for it, and I thought that was helpful. So yeah, I think that would be. And you could do it with theorems too.
Yeah, so kind of I don't think you always have to have a quiz or have a practice of how do I do a problem, more of just do you have a basic concept kind of down,
Right.
And that you don't need a quiz bank for. That you kind of should be able to create a quiz bank.
Right.
I think one of the hard things for students, though, is that how do they know when they've understood a particular concept? Or how do they, so the problems in quiz banks are easy because there is some solution that they should be getting, right? Now, whether they understand it then goes back to how do they know if they've understood it? If they get, like you were mentioning earlier, they can work it out and test themselves. That can test whether they can get to the answer, but how do they know whether they've understood what the problem is and that's hard, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's what teaching is then. That's why teaching is difficult, is how can you actually find a way to measure whether students understand something, but then also how do students know whether they understand something? I think that something like we were saying earlier, quiz bank should work, and it should kind of lead to this repetition of practice, not just I wouldn't necessarily maybe think about it as a patched practice unless they are trying to do the memorizing of the particular problem. If it's done in the right way, I do think it could be a positive thing.
Yeah, but maybe it's just these problems are they all require an algebra trick.
Sure.
Or to
Yeah.
really view them in a way that's not obvious at first, which I think is that is an important skill for them to have. But if every single problem they're encountering in the quiz bank, they can't just be right, I can just sit down and I can just do this. If I just understand all the concepts.
Yeah.
And feeling I have to memorize this trick.
No,
If I don't know the trick, then I'm not going to get this done. In my 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, that reminds me that one complaint that I had from the students is that there's such a discrepancy between what they do on the homework, I think it's My Math
My
Lab,
math lab, yeah.
and then what they have in the project, and then what that's expected on the quizzes. So they think that there is a huge difference between them.
So they want them all to be the same?
More similar, I suppose.
Or maybe just more scaffolding. I mean, if they have to do something that's a really difficult problem and there's some trick involved, they've got My Math Lab where they can rely on all the resources there to help them solve it, and all of a sudden they have to solve this really hard problem, and they're just like, I don't know where to go from here.
Yeah, it kind of seems like they do a lot of repetition maybe on My Math Lab, and then all of a sudden it's just like
This is
reinventing.
this is entirely different. Yeah.
Yeah, like finding the trick.
It's like you jumped off some rocks. Let's go skydiving.
Well, so one thing about the quiz bank, all of the quiz bank problems have hints because there's a version with hints and there's a version with solutions and all that. What if you put the hints on the quiz? I don't know if that's.
I wonder, so the Calc 3 quizzes, like, especially recently, have been very much about, like, working with vectors and finding equations of lines or equations of planes. And all of that has been, like, there is an intuitive way to approach it. Say, like, oh, can you understand what's going on? Now, what are the tools that you can use to then analyze this problem, and then can you do those tools? And so in that way, like, specifically for that, a lot of students have bought into trying to understand it. But I'm just piecing this together as people are kind of talking about stuff. I could definitely see in, like, especially Calc 2 in particular, right? There's a lot of skills that need to be learned there, that the concepts are almost too deep for the type of class that they're taking. And so then, is the quiz bank effective for something like that? Yeah.
It's just, So I think the one thing that kind of comes to mind is like all those like trig subs, and substitution, and like how to like, and that's when they're starting to memorize like, what do I, like, and it's not like what do I do if I have something that looks like this. They're just like, okay, I have to integrate tangent to the sixth.
Yeah.
So that means I choose you to be this because that's the hint, and they don't know why. They don't know like why that was a smart choice, and Which, I mean, that's nothing to do with, like, U substitutions. I mean, it kind of does, but, like, knowing that when you're integrating tangent to the sixth.
They can do the skill on that one problem. They can't then generalize that to maybe something else.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that in Calc 2. Like, even the solids of revolution, right? You've got the two methods, like the disk or washer, I forget. Then the shell method, and like if you think about where those come from, it's very intuitive to which one to use. But if you have no idea and you're just memorizing a formula, it's hard. I think.
Well, I thought that there was an excellent discussion of that in class today when you were talking with the one guy in the front row who was like, well, what if I just want to go right to the integral and not think about the Riemann sums? And like, you can, but if you do think about the Riemann sums, then as Heather said, you pretty much can always figure out what you should actually be doing, and you don't need to really know the formula.
You won't be able to understand when the formula will break.
Yeah.
I don't know if like other students noticed that was a good discussion, but I felt like it was.
You nudge all the people in the back next to you and be like, this is really good. Pay attention to this.
We sit up front. I should sit in the back.
Just stand up and turn around and just point.
My dad
Like,
talks about
Put your phones down. This is the good stuff of the day.
My dad talks about being in college and that there was someone who said, I wish I had a big red light that would flash because this is a really important point. And he's like, the thing is I remember him talking about the red light, but I have no idea what he was talking about.
Oh, no.
So even if you had jumped up and said something, I'm not sure that they would have,
They just would have remembered you.
Yeah, they would have remembered.
That's how you leave an impact in the world.
Pay attention. Yeah, I think your comment though about, do students really know when they understand something is something I've wondered about a lot. And, like you get into all these applications of the integral, there's separate problems, but there's really one unifying theme, divide and add up. But then I think back to how well did I really understand calculus when I got out of calculus, and you've all grown a lot and you understand of calculus just by teaching it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know what you can. I wonder what I can expect of students by the time we're done with the class.
I think especially too, like with freshmen, a lot of them don't know how to study.
Yes.
So, like, I mean, when I was in high school, I remember a couple classes where they kind of tried to teach us how to study, but like, they just said, do practice problems. Okay. But that's like all I was told for math specifically. I mean, math, obviously, I'm in math, so it came pretty naturally to me, but it took me a long time to learn how to study math, and it took getting to my upper level classes to realize I needed to do it and how to do it. But I don't really think they know how to study. So like they have these quiz banks and they're just like doing the problems, right? They're not looking at the concepts and stuff. And I don't really know how you can fix that. I guess.
The authors talk about reflection also being a good piece
Yeah.
of memory building and retrieving, and it would be interesting to have some sort of reflection question on, okay, so questions 1 through 3, is there a common trend between these 3 questions? Why? What is it?
Yeah, after they work through the quiz bank, because that's what we kind of do. Well, that's what I do in recitation. Is I
Good.
kind of say, what's the theme here? You
Good.
know, the plane is you dot 2 vectors and it's supposed to equal 0. So that's how you get that equation all the time.
No, I was thinking that earlier about like just having those questions. Not a question of what is this and what's the answer to it, but like what are the quote unquote steps that you would take, or what are the large concepts that are used for this particular problem.
Even like after lecture, you leave lecture and you just pull out your phone and I don't know. They all use Snapchat, so start Snapchatting, right? But like if you're walking out of class, you should be like, okay, what did we just talk about? Instead of just like figure it out later when I'm doing my homework. Even just doing that for like, the 30 seconds you're walking out of the room would be helpful.
Something I tried over the summer was doing exam corrections. It's kind of like after they take the exam, they see what they like got wrong, so we wouldn't make that many comments on them. And then they're supposed to be like, okay, my problems I did wrong. What did I need to do different to like get them right?
I've done that.
I'm a big fan of correcting.
Just out of curiosity, did you do the entire exam? Like what was your format for like just correct the whole thing or correct a problem?
Yeah, it was problems you got like less than 50% on.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you got at least 50% there, it's fine. It was kind of part of like a take-home like portion of the exam that they did after they had the in-class exam, and then it'd be like 3 days, and then they'd have like a take-home portion that they could do.
Nice.
Did you need comments about that and whether they felt that was helpful or?
I mean, I thought it would help them. Because, a lot of them were much more, like, there was very few, like, computational math problems that I did on there. They were a lot more of, like, explain, what, I don't know, what is a derivative, mean in, like, a larger context. And those were kind of just, like, fun for me to read. Like, what were their understandings of this?
Right.
How many of them were, like, looking up the definition in the textbook and copying that out, and then try to elaborate, for another couple lines on that.
Rephrase the definition in their own words.
Yeah, no, they're like, it's in my handwriting, my own words. But then they're actually like reading it. They're actually having to write it out
And think about it. Just like
yeah, and so
that's nice.
no one said they hated it, so I'm assuming that means it was great.
Was it optional for them, or did they have to do it if they got lower than a certain?
No, so the way it was set up, it was like 8 problems, and then they did 6, and like the correcting in the exam was one of them. But yeah, if you had to get like less than 50% on like at least 4 problems on like a 6 problem exam or something, so if you kind of did well in the exam, then you just had to do more just other things.
Well, that's kind of interleaving a little bit, right? They talk about interleaving in the book, where you're using more than one subject. So you're kind of using writing there. I've heard of people doing, like my physics class, we had to do weekly journals. I hated it. But like, looking back, I get it. Because every week it was just write a page, right? It was a page double spaced, so it's like nothing. But write about like what went well, what don't you quite understand yet, and that was it. But they were interleaving, like we were required to have writing components in a lot of our classes actually. That's why. But
It's probably like a really like different way for the professor to like check in with you guys. Of, like,
yeah,
it's not like clicker questions. It's like
yeah.
in your own words. Can you lie to me and say everything's perfect?
Yeah.
I'm guessing that was at a somewhat smaller school, though.
State school, small state school.
Okay.
8,000 something students. Yeah, it was a small classroom. I had 2 teachers and a TA. I think they team taught. It was like, I think it was team-based learning, and they just never told us. Like, looking back, we had quizzes before class. We were in teams. There was no lecture. We'd have to read the book. These writing things. But, so, like, now that I know what team-based learning is, I've been thinking back. I'm like, I think that's what it was. But, yeah.
And did you say you did hate that?
Oh.
I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I teach with it now, but I'm not sure that I would have appreciated it when I was a learner.
I think I wasn't ready for it.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know how to study. Like, I think that was part of the issue. I was also kind of in this... It was the time where I was a chem major. I was switching to math, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. So it was kind of my bad semester overall also. It's hard now because I look back and I'm like, oh, Mary, you could have done, like, could have learned so much more if you put the effort in. But, yeah, it was okay. I mean, it was a lot of work.
That's what our students say.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
I think the nice thing about that story, though, is like whether or not students hate the way that the class is set up, still saying, oh, I wish I would have done more. So, like, forcing students to do more, they might dislike it right at that moment, but they might enjoy the fact that it was difficult for them later. Maybe not. But.
Well, that's what a lot of these studies, right, there's, sorry, this may not be exactly bouncing off of that, but these studies, I don't remember which ones, but some of them were like, okay, when they're tested right away with the people that did, like, interleaving or not mass practice or whatever topic they're talking about, they're tested right away and they do about the same or even worse, but then they're tested later and they do better, which is interesting.
I thought it was also interesting. I think I put it on number 18.
Yeah.
They told the story of teaching students different art forms or different artists and their works, and how many students, even after experiencing, oh, wait a minute, it's better if that interleaving is and mixing it up of the practice occurs, we're doing better, and yet many of them still went back to massed practice after the experiment was over. Which I guess makes me feel, oh, no wonder so many students left TBL after this semester. I think it's just that idea of, well, this feels more comfortable to me. So it feels a little bit easier to me, and I feel like I'm making better progress when that intuition is wrong in this case.
I know it's easier to do mass practice too. I mean, that's how a lot of books are set up now, and
Yeah,
maybe it's just more convenient to say, okay, I'll work on this section.
right.
So
It's my math lab now is starting to do some interweaving.
Right.
If you download the homeworks they put together,
Mm-hmm.
there is, I see, about 20% review in there.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested. This is a thought I had while reading through it. There was in the third chapter they were mentioning this interleaving stuff of saying, okay, you don't just want to focus on this topic and then move on to this topic. They gave like an example of if you had like a 5-step program that you were trying to teach people, maybe you do like mass practice would be do 1, make sure you've got it, do 2, make sure you've got it, do 3, make sure you've got it. And they said, maybe do 1 a little bit, and then maybe let's focus on 4, and then let's focus on 2. Like that's kind of what they gave. And just before that, they had several studies about why this is useful. And then they have this example of like how you could do that. The next paragraph is about mathematics and saying, oh, most mathematics books are set up to be mass practice, where the first chapter is all this, the second chapter is to be this, so on and so forth. And then the next chapter after that, they go to this artist study. And there's no study about like how this is used in mathematics or if that actually works. Which made me wonder, like, because mathematics, a lot of the way the subject is set up, it is very much built on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So is interleaving really look like, oh, I'm going to focus on this topic, and like what does it look like in a mathematics classroom? Because it wouldn't necessarily, I think, look the same way as the examples that they were using for sports. Say,
Mm-hmm.
do this, now let's do something else, let's practice something else, now let's practice something else.
So I think the difference, like at least with the sports one, is like in theory they all like already kind of like know how to do everything, and so it's just kind of like it's more of a kind of like, not that we're gonna be like learning something brand new, but just like how are we keeping up with like kind of where we are, and then maybe like they run like a new drill at the end.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's like helpful for math to like do reviews or kind of like throw things in, like even when we're talking about the quiz bank, do all of the problems have to be on the topic of like that week, or could some of them be from things like before they're coming back? And I think that's how it more looks for math. It's not that you're skipping ahead,
I agree.
but you're more like skipping backwards.
Well, and Dr. Johnston has done that in terms of setting up my math lab assignments for our calculus classes. And do you remember how to take the derivative of an inverse function? And what about this trigonometry problem? And so, I mean, both anticipating what they're going to need for what's coming up, but also let's keep this fresh.
Something I thought about though, like you talk about breaking the program down step by step, like, and then like I thought of something for sports too, like 'cause I used to coach rowing, and people don't come to college knowing how to row, so you got to teach them how to row, and and people really want to like, it's 3 steps. You extend the legs, then you lean back, then you finish with the arms, and then you do it in reverse order, and people want to lean back first, and then you're going to throw out your back and stuff like that. So you got to teach them the order of the stroke. And so the way I was taught, and this is just you drill, is you just do legs over and over, and then you do legs and back, and then you over and over, and then you do legs, back, and arms over and over. But then I did, there was a semester where I worked with this guy, Bob Jogstetter, and he coached for the national team and stuff like that. So he knew his stuff. But he would have his new rowers do all 3 together, just really, really slow. And it's kind of like, you got to see how this all goes together, I guess. And sometimes I wonder when I'm teaching, like, and when I'm learning, like, are we hammering something? Are we too specific now? You can't see the big picture anymore. Or what? Yeah. So I feel like a good teacher is going to take time to kind of outline where everything fits, and then come back and start going back into the sequence of things.
Like in the calc sequence context, that seems to mostly come up in terms of like, then here are some applications problems that will show you a flavor of what you might expect in your physics class, even though they'll actually do it totally differently or whatever with dots for derivatives and whatever the heck they do. Like, I don't know, that totally makes sense in like a graduate math course, but I don't know if you can give a big picture on like, right now we're talking about applications of integration techniques, and like the big picture is just kind of being agile at using your calculus skills in some sense, it seems like to me. I mean, you said that it's about cutting things up and adding it up, but like, I don't know if that's, I don't know if every student would find that to be like, I think it's like very profound and cool, but you might have to be already math flavored to.
Yeah, I can't remember what I thought about that when I was taking calculus. But our book, is set up with, here's how you rotate about the x-axis, here's the formula, here's how you put about the y-axis. And, it seems to encourage you to memorize all these things and hope you can fit your problem into the right slot, and it's automatic.
I mean, when I took maybe Calc 3, was allowed like a formula sheet. So it was just, all right, which formula matches the problem? Almost encouraging it. Or discouraging it, I don't know.
I do think like the outlining, exactly like outlining ideas before you go through them is one form of kind of breaking things up and making counter to memorization, saying, okay, these are kind of the things that you're going to, this is the overarching idea. You may not completely understand all of it right now, but we're going to go back through and kind of fill in some of the details. I know some students really dislike that kind of thing, but I also think it's super helpful.
I always felt as a Calc 3 TA that especially at the end we do Stokes' theorem of just really like sitting down in recitation, just being like, okay, here's the two formulas. Here's Green's theorem, and here's Stokes' theorem. Here's the flux, equation of 3. All right, here's how you can essentially take any problem on your exam and pick which one of these you use. And not feeling like really good about it, but it was also like, you guys have a final in 2 weeks. We don't have time to really understand what these are about and really think about the situation.
I felt the same way.
Which really sucks, because that's the part of the class where finally you can see the super cool, extremely high level big picture, and it makes everything fit together, and there's no time to talk about it in any actual version of Calc 3.
There's not, yeah, I felt the same way.
This is there's these two goals. What is the student's goal of the course? Well, to pass it, right? And what's our goal for the students? We want them to pass, but I'd like to be able to see them on the streets 2 years later and say, how would you find them on with that thing and have them answer?
Who are you?
Officer?
Well, very good. We won't keep you past 3 too much, but if you'd like to join us, we'll talk about chapter 4. I think we'll just do one chapter next time. So, yes, it is. So, thanks for coming, everyone.